Well, in our culture, we really have two different kinds of people. And it's an unfortunate thing that we do because really there wasn't meant to be a divide. On the one hand, you have people, and we're going to call these people the truth people, who are very concerned with getting things right, to have the right answer about something. And I probably identify with those people. I love to seek out, well, what is the way that things are? But unfortunately, these people often forget that there is another side. And this other side is demonstrated by those they would often make fun of, because the truth people look across and they see these people, we'll call them the love people, and the love people say, you know, why can't we just all get along and love one another? What neither one of them really understands is that the problem in the divide is not something new. In fact, this problem goes all the way back to the beginning. And so today let's actually start by taking a look all the way back at the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. So the book of Genesis, in the very first chapter, we have a verse, Genesis 1:26. And it says, God created man in his image. So in Genesis 1:26, you have God who makes a man, and he makes a woman, and he makes all sorts of creatures, including these, we'll call them dancing sheep, and all sorts of trees. And so God says to the man, he says he blessed him and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion. This is the order in which it is. God creates man who has dominion over creation. God puts man in a garden. The garden has two trees, and we all know what comes from there. Because within the garden, there was a tree called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that tree ends up getting mankind into trouble in just a little bit. But let's talk about this. First of all, when you have things that are related properly, when they are in the right order, you have something that is called shalom. Most people understand the idea of shalom as peace, or the absence of conflict. But what I want to propose is that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of a proper relationship. We'll put this idea up here in purple, because purple is a wonderful color. I sound like I'm a preschool teacher. So you have this idea of shalom, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of the way that things are supposed to be. Now, here at Created, we like to talk about this using a phrase, to relate rightly. And if you notice, this idea, to relate rightly, has two different parts to it. On the one hand, you have the part of relationship, which people on the love side would say, yes, this is wonderful. Let's definitely get going on this. Let's relate. But you also have this idea on the truth side, where let us relate rightly in the way that things are designed to be. So we're going all the way back to the beginning. God creates an order. Everything relates rightly. It all works out well. But something happens. And here's what we have the story of, is that man, instead of looking to God for his identity, begins to look for a tree. And we can take a look at this story, actually, if we go to Genesis chapter 3. And you have this tree of knowledge. And I'm actually going to put that right up here. So you have the tree of knowledge. And this is the story of the first Adam and of Eve. So we're going to put this over here, just so we remember who we're talking about. So the first Adam has the tree of knowledge and begins to look from himself as the starting point, saying, oh, look, I can get this knowledge for myself. But he wants to move beyond knowledge, because it says that Eve looked upon the tree and she saw that the tree was desirable for something. It was desirable to make one wise. So by taking the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the hope was to eventually reach this point of wisdom through effort. So you begin with knowledge and you eventually end with wisdom. Most people understand this today. When you go in through any kind of process of learning, you begin to collect knowledge. Hopefully you collect enough knowledge that eventually you get something, it's a little bit elusive, but hopefully you reach this point of understanding. And then when you finally leave the educational system, one wishes you the best of luck. Maybe you'll be able to do something with it, which we would consider to be wisdom. Now, I want to propose that perhaps there is a different design, that what happened in Genesis chapter 3 is not the way that things were supposed to be. And in fact, if we look at the story of King Solomon, and we look at a few other stories, we'll find out there actually is another option for looking at this. Because you have shalom when man first looks to God and speaks to creation, but this gets broken when man begins to look to creation for the ability to do what he is supposed to do. So let's move to 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3 is the story of King Solomon. He has recently become the king of Israel. He's just been crowned. He goes off to a place called Gibeon where he's offering sacrifices to God. God comes to him in a dream and offers him anything he wants. And King Solomon says, you know what, I have a problem. And here's what my problem is. I don't know how to go out and to come in before this great people that you've given me. In other words, he said, I don't know what to do. And for this point, let's actually use wisdom as a working definition. Solomon said, I don't have wisdom. I don't know what to do. And you can look throughout and you'll find that this is actually a pretty typical way of understanding wisdom. And we'll look at the Proverbs a little bit more to flesh this idea out. Solomon, though, he begins to seek his wisdom in a different source. He goes to God and says, I don't have wisdom. And this is something that the book of James actually talks to us about. It says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God. And so you see, we have a different starting point to the starting point that we have in Genesis chapter 3. And if we all know what happens in the Proverbs, there's a verse that says pride, or starting with yourself, goes before a fall. So even though it might lead to wisdom going through this way, you actually end up in a place you don't really want to be. Solomon, on the other hand, goes to God first as a source of wisdom, and he becomes what we now think of as the wisest person who ever lived. So Solomon is asking God for this thing called wisdom. He wants to know what to do. But in 1 Kings chapter 3, he specifically asks for something. He says, give me an understanding mind so that I can govern your people, that I can discern or judge between good and evil, for who is able to govern your people? So he says twice in this passage, who is able to govern your people? I want to be able to govern your people well. And this is what he considers to be part of an understanding mind. I'm proposing this is a little bit different than how we normally think about it. I think that in Solomon's mind, understanding had two parts. On the one hand, he wanted to be able to relate well to other people, which we can describe as the word empathy. On the other hand, he also realized that in order to be a good leader or govern his people, he had to be able to judge between ideas. And we call this word discernment. So there are two sides to this understanding that he seeks. And let's find out just a little bit more about wisdom and understanding by going to the book that Solomon wrote. So if we go all the way to the Proverbs, we can take a look at Proverbs chapter 1, 2, and 3 and find out just a little bit more. What is this wisdom? What is this understanding? And oh, by the way, if knowledge and the tree of knowledge got people into such trouble, should we even be looking at this at all? So Proverbs chapter 1 gives us the reason why the Proverbs are written. If you take a look at the first verse, it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David. So written by a wise guy, we're probably going to think of him as somebody we could learn from. But the significant thing to note in the very first verse is that he considers himself to be a son. So the very first thing that he does to put himself in the place of wisdom is to be a son, or to be in relationship. And this is where learning begins to happen. The second verse then says what the Proverbs are written for: to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. So wisdom is knowing what to do, and just say you don't know what to do. Maybe it's a good idea to ask someone what to do. That's the idea of instruction. So if you don't have wisdom, you seek out someone who does have wisdom, and they can instruct you in it. But next, to understand words of insight, and if you go all the way down to verse 7 in Proverbs chapter 1, you get this verse. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Fools do not begin at this point, and there is something called the fear of the Lord, which leads to knowledge. So next to this, I'm going to put the idea of fear of the Lord, because this is going to be a key concept that we come back to a few times here. So fear of God works quite well. But if we take a look at Proverbs chapter 2, it will tell us about the second step in our process. So Solomon asks God for wisdom, and he asks as well for understanding. And Proverbs chapter 2 tells us a little bit about how understanding comes to be. It begins in verse 1. My son, again this relationship, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight or discernment and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures. This is not an easy process. Understanding is not something that is simply handed to you in the same way that instruction is. It must be sought out. It must be something that you acquire for yourself. But if you will seek for it and search for it as for hidden treasures, verse 5, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Do you see what this outcome is? Again, we're back to this idea that we're going to find the fear of the Lord. And this is somehow a key to this process of learning. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 3, though, and this will tell us just a little bit more about what the process looks like. If you go to Proverbs 3, verses 19 and 20, you get this relationship between wisdom and understanding and knowledge, which is somewhat surprising to us at first. Because typically we think of knowledge being a collection of information, leading to understanding, leading hopefully to knowing what to do. The Proverbs, however, reverses this order. Proverbs 3:19 says, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. And by his knowledge, the deeps broke open and the clouds dropped down their dew. The first time I read this, I thought there must have been some mistake. Nobody in the Proverbs could be this stupid and get the order wrong, right? Until I went to the later part of the Proverbs and found in Proverbs chapter 24 that there is the exact same sort of relationship, but this time it's applied to a human being. It says, by wisdom, Proverbs 24, verse 3 and 4, by wisdom a house is built. By understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So we have twice now this idea that wisdom is the starting point. Wisdom is where it all begins. But it's not just enough to do something, to know what to do without understanding why. But this understanding why must be something that you seek out and search for. And once you understand, you have now established something. And furthermore, there is a third step which leads to knowledge. And we'll talk in just a little bit about knowledge, because knowledge in the Hebrew context is not the same as what we've been thinking of knowledge so far as the collection of information. So to pick up, what is our responsibility? As Christians, we know this story. We know how all of this got started. We know there's a problem. We know shalom is gone. We look at the world around us, and even the very fact that we have this split between truth and love is in itself a demonstration that things are not properly ordered in the way that they're meant to be. But we as Christians have this duty, this responsibility to be salt and light in this world. How do we take what we have here and begin to bring hope to people? So here's the question. Truth and love. Are these two things ever meant to be separate? And I think we know that the answer to that question is no. These things are not meant to be separate. In fact, if you take a look at Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 through 16, it says, this is the way in which we grow up into Christ, who is the head. It is by speaking the truth in love. It is when these things come together that the church actually grows into maturity the way that it's supposed to. Opposite this, though, and simply to reinforce the idea, we can take a look at the Proverbs. And the Proverbs give us an idea. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19, they give us an idea of the things that God hates. Really, not the most inspiring passage, but it's a really quality thing to learn from. If we take a look at this, 6 things the Lord hates, 7 are an abomination to him. And here's where the truth people are going to be happy about half of it, and the love people are going to be happy about the other half. And here's why. Because you get to near the end of this, and it says, God hates a false witness who speaks lies. And you get to the very next line, and he says, and one who sows discord among brothers. you have two things that are equally problematic. When these two things are split, you actually have more of a symptom of the problem. So when we're asking, well, how do we as Christians confront the lack of truth in the world and the lack of love in the world, maybe these two things actually come together all at once. And I want to propose, if we take a look at Jesus, that he's actually a key to this. Because in John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Furthermore, when he stands in front of Pilate and Pilate asks him the most profound question, what is truth? Jesus simply stands there and looks at him. And I think there's not really a more excellent answer than that, because if Jesus is the truth and Pilate asks, what is truth? Truth is there staring him in the face. At the same time, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and we know from 1 John that God is love. And so you have all at once embodied in Jesus both truth and love at the same time. And as Christians, we have the same call, because Jesus came in answer to this problem that is what happened here. This break in relationship, this disorder of creation. And Romans tells us that all of creation actually groans in pains of childbirth. Romans chapter 8, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. Now, if Jesus is our example, we have to ask the question, how is it that love and truth can come together in our lives? To begin with, we have a couple of problems that we need to think about. And the first problem we have is this, that not all ideas are created equal. I'm gonna have to get a new marker eventually. So not all ideas are created equal, which is what requires this idea of discernment, that we can judge between these ideas. At the exact same time, if we were to go to some political documents and say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So we say that all people, unlike all ideas, are created equal. And the reason for this actually goes all the way back to Genesis, because all people are created in the image of God. So not all ideas are created equal, but all people are created equal. And the reason why we care about ideas being different and discerning between them is because people act on ideas. Ideas are the things that affect how we live and how we relate to each other. So if we are really going to function well on this love side, we're going to have to figure out something on this truth side as well. We've already talked about the idea that Jesus demonstrates both of these things. And so when we're trying to begin to embody this ourselves, this is a process of growing up into maturity, or you could even say a process of learning or education. It begins with this idea of immersing in love. Because if we do not know the love of God, how are we going to then love our neighbor? Jesus gives us the greatest commandment and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I think the order there is actually significant for a reason. But in the same way that we immerse in love, we have this idea in 1 Peter, I believe it's 1 Peter 2:2, that as newborn babes, so as infants in Christ, we want to desire the pure spiritual milk. This is the pure spiritual milk of the Word. So we're immersing ourselves in truth. So this idea of repeated exposure. And so if we're going to be fixing this process, this thing that is broken, we're going to have to begin by encountering something that is not broken. But that's not where we end, because to immerse in truth and to immerse in love, it gives us an idea of what to do, of how to be, of who we're called. But we want to move beyond that. We want to engage with it. This is not something that can be handed to us. This is something we have to acquire. Again, remember this idea of wisdom. And if we take a look at the book of Hebrews, the author of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 5, he actually gets frustrated with the people that he's talking to. He says, by now you should be grown-ups, ready to eat meat, but again I have to give you this milk, this basic idea. You guys have not matured in your faith. And then he goes on to tell them, well, here's what you can do if you want to mature in your faith. And he says, the way you mature in your faith, the way in which you develop your skills of discernment in order to mature, is by constantly practicing with them. So there's this idea of constant practice that follows this immersion. So you must constantly practice, putting forth effort. And we have a similar idea that emerges right after 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is popularly known as the love chapter. The very next verse following that chapter begins with two words. It's a command. It says to pursue love. This again is an active thing. It requires some sort of activity. And so we put this over here. A pursuit of love is going to require a constant practice of love. But again, constantly practicing isn't the goal. Because when we come back over here, when we look at this idea, there is a third step. And this third step, if we take a look at knowledge and we say, okay, why does this play such a significant role? Why do we have to know God in order to have information? It doesn't make any sense. Which means we need to redefine our definition of the word knowledge and maybe begin to think about it in the way that the people in Israel might have thought about it. Maybe we think about it the way Solomon thought about it and realize that in Hebrew, the word for knowledge is something called yada. And that word incorporates a whole lot more depth than our understanding of knowledge. In fact, it has two possible explanations. On the one hand, it means to be able to define and embody an idea, and on the other hand, it can also mean to intimately know and relate to an individual. Do you see how this includes both sides? Again, both things are coming together. But not only is there an intimate acquaintance with a thing, it also requires some kind of stewardship of that which is known. And through this stewardship, and maybe you've watched this happen in relationships between a husband and wife, how they begin to look like each other, even physically over time. It's kind of funny, right? And they begin to think alike, they begin to act alike, they begin to embody the idea. And so when we look at this, you want to immerse in love, constant practice in love, but the point isn't that you become somebody who's really skilled at love, who can act like a loving person. The point of this is that you want to become a loving person. So I'm just going to put the word become here. You want to become a person who embodies love. And the same thing happens over here with truth, is when you're constantly practicing sharpening your tools of discernment, it's not so that you can identify truth and say this is truth and act like you know truth. It is so that you can embody truth, so that you can become the kind of person that people look at and say, yes, there is something about truth in that person. You see, this is knowledge on a whole different level. This is this idea of yada, taking this beyond a knowledge which hopefully leads to wisdom and saying, let's start with the fear of God and see where that takes us. Now, in order to become is going to require this constant practice. Remember, we had the step from wisdom, knowing what to do. If you don't know what to do, seeking instruction. Understanding, which is this idea of constant practice, down to knowledge, where you begin to embody and express the ideas that you're talking about. And so we come to this point where we're asking the question, well, what's the difference? You have wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, which is the progression that we see in the Proverbs, and then you see this knowledge, understanding, wisdom, which is how we typically see this. And let's take a look at a couple other examples in the Bible which demonstrate the implications of what it means to flip this upside down. We've already seen this idea of the first Adam and Eve who were able to grab knowledge for themselves. They said, oh look, we can possess knowledge, and through this possession of it we can figure out what to do. The tree and the fruit was desirable to make one wise. On the other hand, you have a couple of examples who follow that. One of those early examples we have is the story of Abraham. And Abraham we're going to put in contrast with someone named Nimrod. Abraham we find out about in Genesis chapter 12. And in Nimrod, we actually find out about him in Genesis chapter 11 alongside the Tower of Babel. And I always kind of wondered what that story about the Tower of Babel was doing there right before you get to the story of Abraham. And I think it's there so that we see this tiny little contrast. And this contrast actually becomes incredibly significant the more that we look at it. Because in the story of the Tower of Babel, there is a motivation for the people to do what they did. They said, let us make a name for ourselves. We want to build an identity. We want to find our security in something that we are able to do. In contrast, you move to Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham, and God comes to him and says, I will make a name for you. Now, if we're looking at the biblical story and we're going to contrast the first Adam, it's only fair that we look at the second Adam, which would be the story of Jesus. And we know the story of Jesus from Philippians that well, how do I begin this? So Jesus, it says in Philippians, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He made himself of no reputation. So Jesus went the opposite way of these guys. Instead of trying to get a reputation or an ability for himself, he made himself nothing, becoming obedient to the point of death. And this is the significant part, because Philippians tells us that God exalted him to the highest place and gave him a name that is above every other name. So this problem that we have of broken shalom isn't just a problem of seeking wisdom. This is a problem of where we are going for the source of our identity. It's asking us, what is the starting point? What is the motivation? What is the thing that drives us in pursuit of wisdom? And where do we go to? What is the source? What is at the heart of this journey? So the final thing I want to talk about is really what is at the heart. And here you really have two choices. We have up here the fear of God. We have down here something we could call the fear of man. And the fear of God is known as something, and we get this idea from Philippians 2 again, this idea of humility. Little tiny purple thing up here, if you can't read it. The idea of humility, and then down here you have the idea of what is the opposite of humility. And really this is the choice that is facing every one of us. Is, are we going to try to define ourselves and say, let us make a name for ourselves? Are we going to reach for what's in front of us that we can grasp? Or are we in humility going to come to God and ask for wisdom? And I want to demonstrate what this looks like. And just to kind of tie all of this together into a single picture. Let's just say we as human beings are multidimensional. We're complicated creatures. And if you take a look, let's just pretend that for a moment we are a triangle. We are made up of several different parts. And if we only speak to one of these parts, we would say that your education is not holistic. If you speak to the whole person, that's what a holistic kind of education is all about. And we've already seen this idea that with wisdom there is some sort of an action. There is a knowing what to do. In order to act, you must move your body. So there is a physical component to this process of learning. However, that goes beyond that, because with understanding, you're discerning ideas and learning how to relate or to relate well to other people, using your emotions, using your thoughts and ideas. This is stuff that happens in the mind. So we are psychological creatures. And then if you look at this idea of yada, which is this relationship between people and ideas, you again find out that mankind is not just somebody who analyzes people and ideas with the mind, but somebody who relates to them. So we have a sociological factor as well. But what really makes the difference is this question: what is at the heart of the process of learning? Let's look at this. If we're able to address all three elements of the individual, it still does not necessarily get us where we want to be. In fact, I will show you one final thing, because remember the choice is one between humility and pride. Which place is going to be your starting point? This starting point is going to be the thing that is right at the center of your educational process. Because there is a fourth dimension which so many of us don't ever get around to thinking about. And that is this dimension, and it's a spiritual dimension. It's the question of who are you going to worship? Who are you going to fear? This is going to be the starting point in the process of education that changes everything. Because when you have this shape, you have a two-dimensional triangle, and you can put the point in the middle, but when every element of education is connected to this point, when this relationship with God is at the very heart of the journey, you get a totally new design altogether. You get something that is completely different. So all of this comes back to a choice. We've seen what happens when man looks to nature in order to define himself. When we choose to look to our own efforts to acquire knowledge, hopefully leading to wisdom, knowing what to do, we've seen the results. Pride leads to destruction, and a haughty spirit comes before a fall. On the other hand, you have this wonderful verse in Proverbs that says, with humility and fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Now these three things are things that we already know about from the book of Proverbs as belonging to wisdom. And so what you have here is one cycle leading to an end, to this idea of destruction. And on the other hand, you have this cycle of humility, which is leading to knowledge and back again to wisdom. Because if you go through the process, you begin with humility and fear of the Lord, you find wisdom, you practice for understanding, you begin to embody knowledge, and the process begins all over again. So the choice is simple, but it's very difficult. Is it going to start with the fear of man, or is it going to start with the fear of God? Whichever direction you go changes everything.